So this marks part 3 of my reflections and commentary on chapter 26 of the Proverbs. Last time I had finished with verse 11, and I'll continue now with verse 12. Just to give this experience a little bit of context, to unravel or illustrate the setting a little bit. It happens to be in the evening after work. It's around 8:30 p.m. The sun is set. It's a nice day today, mid-70s, low 70s. We're at the point in the year when the temperature begins to be cold enough at night that we probably could justify wearing a hoodie or a long-sleeve shirt. It's quiet. The mind is working its way down or up, depending on how you think of it, to something that is meaningful, to something that is leveled, something that is principled. See you a man wise in his own conceit? There is more hope of a fool than of him. Now this is verse 12. So let's begin breaking this down. We're going to begin with the first half of the verse. See you a man wise in his own conceit. So this is something that is posed as a question. And so we should attempt to answer it. But we need first a solid understanding of a couple terms, that of conceit and that of wise. And then, of course, the relationship between these terms. So let's begin with the word conceit. Last episode, I had spent a lot of time talking about the nature of the fool. Also, a lot of time talking about my own experience with that fool within me. Chapter 26 seems to be a chapter that is devoted to the fool. And it's been a productive series so far, determining, drawing conclusions based on the verses and what we are prompted to consider. But conceit has already come up at least once in this chapter already. And it's an interesting term, a term that is well related to the foolish person or the foolish disposition. Now, just a standard Google definition of the term conceit is excessive pride in oneself. We think of vanity, we think of narcissism as related words. Of course, that helps us to a degree to understand what this word means, excessive pride in oneself. But we need to explore this word pride. As many of us approach this term, as I approach this term, there's certainly a negative connotation to it. There are certain dangers that are associated with it. Of pride, in my own words, in my own definition, I think of it to be a glorification, a propping up at the altar, aspects of ourself, or by extension, some behavior or some accomplishment for which we value highly, or perhaps begin to worship. Now there's a desire to examine this term pride, again within the context of conceit, which seems to be a bit more directional. within the definition of the word conceit, there is this term excessive, indicating perhaps that there is an aspect of pride that may not necessarily be entirely negative. So again, my mind is desiring this exploration of the term pride, a full exploration of the term. Now what flashes before me now is the desire to say that I wish to remove the cultural connotations that surround the term, but I'm not sure that's possible. Our cultural experiences, I think, form the meaning of the words that we use. So although perhaps there's an aspect within our culture that many of us know that pride comes before the fall, that cultural distinction really doesn't tell us what the word means or how it necessarily leads to the fall. We just know by that expression that we should be careful of it. So let's explore this a little bit. It can be said that a person takes pride in their work. It is often said of a parent that cares for their child, that they are proud of them. That when we accomplish something good, it is often the case that a friend, or again, a family member, a parent, says you should be proud of what you have accomplished. It is a good thing. And in these examples of cultural indication, indicating potentially what the word pride means, associated with it is not something negative. It is not something that we would expect to lead us to the fall. It is something, and of the context for which it is used, it is a word that is used rather endearingly. And one must wonder why that's the case. For if we take one situation, I'm proud of you. Of course, this is an external pride. This is of one person extending a feeling that they have for another. If somebody cares for another and they say that I'm proud of you, what they are saying is that they acknowledge your experiences. They feel the accomplishment that you have gained. And it is that feeling that they dwell in, that they reflect on. And I have to wonder if we are not talking about something that is a double-edged sword here, one side being productive, the other being destructive. But first, I think we need to talk more about the core of this word pride. The question that I have is pride primarily an emotion? Is it a rational thought, independent of emotion? Or is it both? Or can it exist within both domains separately? And this is a difficult one to answer. For surely, for somebody else, if we just take the first example, if a parent is proud of their son or daughter, there must be a reason for that pride. Again, the pride usually is not used in the context of lethargy, for example. A father does not approach a son and say, I am proud of you, as he sits on the couch, gorging himself with treats while he watches television. This is not the typical place for that expression. Rather, I think of it more so when the son graduates high school, graduates college, does well in an exam, a particularly difficult exam. In this situation, the father may say, "I'm proud of you." Now, the pride is there because of the reason of an achievement. It is not something generally seen that lethargy, laziness, is an achievement. But at the outset, the recognition of something that is generally understood to be good and generally recognized as good. On the part of the father, the pride would then be something that is not necessarily negative. That at least in terms of intent, that there is a positive aspect to this experience. That of the individual, for a moment, I'll dive inward inside of myself and think, if I were to express such a thing, I think often it is the case that even though I desire close relationships, even though I wish to connect to people, sometimes my feelings may not necessarily catch up to me. My feelings are a fascinating aspect of my experience. Though I understand and I feel often, sometimes I may say something that I know that when I say it, the feelings will not come in that moment, but I know that because it is a good thing, I say it, despite the feelings. And in that sense, I think that there is a way in which one can express a felt sense, even though it doesn't exist. Now, that may be a lie, and that may be a sin. But I wonder if it is for a greater good, again, for the broader connectedness between two individuals. And in this example, between a father and a son, perhaps. I think of many situations in which the end of the day, for example, can rob us of much of our expression, of our capacity to feel strongly for something. And sometimes the will is that driving engine for which we rationalize and perhaps feel to a degree, if we are not too exhausted to do it. But much like a farmer or a gardener who is concerned about the future of his crop or of his plant, he plants that seed in the earth, not because he expects to see a fully grown and mature tree within minutes. He expects the unfolding of this experience to occur over a number of years, or over the period of a year, half a year for harvest. So I think it can be said that of our feelings and the idea of potential feelings, future feelings, that we could plant some rational seed for which in the future, when conditions are different, perhaps we are less fatigued, or just generally we are in a state of mind that affords us the heart's welcome assistance. That seed, that rational seed, may grow into something that is a much broader, more fulfilled experience. Oh, I understand that this is a bit of an aside, But it is a necessary justification, I think, because there is the possibility in which one may say something, some rational statement, in order to provoke some feeling on the part of another, but our intent is not good. It is rather than to plant the seed for some future bountiful growth, it is to control, to throw a noose around the neck of the person so that we can say great things about what they have done and their accomplishments, so that we can connect ourselves to them, only to use their fond opinion of us against them. Of course, this is a bad thing. Now, this doesn't directly relate, I think, to pride. There is certainly a relationship. But this aside is necessary to justify what I was speaking about earlier, that earlier question about, is pride primarily an emotion, primarily some rational thought, or some combination of the two? And it would seem to me to be that if we follow the path of goodness, if we stay strong in our faith, that we can follow pride through all of these. That it could be both situations. It could be one, primarily a feeling, or primarily some rational thought. Now, for pride to be primarily a feeling, this is not something that I've discussed, but as another aside, I suppose that it is possible that while although, let's say, again, for the example of the father and the son may not have achieved anything in the past month or week, but the father may be reflecting on the son's overall path and trajectory of life. And because of that reflection, there may be spurred within him this emotion, this strong sense of appreciation for what the son is becoming or has become. And in that situation, I could see the father approaching the son and saying, "I'm proud of you," for no particular reason at all. Well, of course there is some reason, but there's no immediate reason. So while the birth of the thought was grounded in feeling for the son, ultimately its expression is tied to some reason. So it's a bit, I think, of a sophisticated experience, this sense of pride in somebody else, at least. But there are different ways that we can relate to this term pride, where we can feel it ourselves for our own experiences, for our own being. There's a lot there to break down and to break apart, to examine. So far, I believe that we have answered this question of, is pride an emotion, a thought, a combination of evil and of goodness? I think it can follow all domains. It can exist and find itself growing in all of those pastures. So the next place I think that we have to step is, of this word pride, in what ways can we say that it is productive or towards good ends? And then in what ways is it true, the cultural statement, that pride comes before the fall? And by extension of this, that pride can be seen as something that is negative and towards negative ends, and perhaps evil. Now, the place in the Bible that we likely get this cultural saying from is the very book of the Proverbs that we are reading now. And we happen to have covered it already. It's in chapter 16. Chapter 16, verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. So the cultural expression, I think, is technically incorrect. that pride goes before the fall. Pride goes before destruction, and the haughty spirit goes before the fall. Now, I say that because of the broader reflection that it would seem that pride, although difficult to define, is something that is not entirely bad or evil, that can have goodness within it. And a part of the reason that I say that, as I've said before, is that within our own cultural usage of the term, we have positive connotations associated with it. But then, of course, there are the negative sides of it, so this word is highly contextual. Now, I should mention that today is a new day, and it's important to mention that because I'm going to be covering probably some new ground as I just had there, and I don't want it to seem overly repetitive without reason. So I would like to turn inward for a moment and examine the subject's experience with the term, because I've already explored what it means to feel pride for somebody else, sort of an empathetic type of experience associated with pride. Now, although I didn't necessarily go into an example where it could be bad in terms of feeling this intense satisfaction from somebody else's achievement, I think we can go the extra step and think of an analogy to satisfy that potential condition. For now, I think it'll suffice to say that that condition exists, as well as the good, as I've given that example with the father and son. But as we turn inward, and rather than feeling an emotion, pleasure at somebody else's achievements, now, instead of having this luxury of the empathy connected to it, which might mitigate some of the potential downsides, we are now going to reflect on an experience of pride that is liberated from the external experience. Now, the term external I don't quite like, but I'll keep it just as a placeholder. And I think that at least my mind understands, even though it may not necessarily be completely satisfactory, ironically enough, I will keep it as it is. So this personal experience, the individual experience now of pride, we are thinking about satisfaction in our achievements. Now, pride is not just a satisfaction. I think that there is an emphasis here when we say pride, that there is a deep sense of this satisfaction. For there are many behaviors that I can enact throughout the day for which I am satisfied. For example, a simple one, going to the bathroom. As I go to the bathroom, I consider that it is a good thing to relieve myself in that way. It needs to be done. If the urgency is built up high enough, then it might disrupt my attention at work, and I have to go through this process of, as we all know. But I wouldn't necessarily turn around, metaphorically, hopefully not physically, and be proud of the experience that had just unfolded. It would seem rather a silly thing to do, and it would be a joke. The reason it would be a joke is because it's not serious, it's not true in totality. There's this lightheartedness to it. Where if we are going to be honest about the type of satisfaction that we are considering, this type of satisfaction is closer to the soul. It's more intimate. A prideful experience if we had to compare something else to that of going to the bathroom as a low-level experience for which we are satisfied for completing, I think of a strong interaction or a positive deed that was done, that I had helped somebody through a particular crisis or difficulty. That is something that would bring me satisfaction that I hold to be highly valuable. There are many other things that I'm sure that would fulfill this category. And within this domain, I think we can fill it with any number of things. And I suppose there may be an individual out there that may attribute high value and satisfaction from very simple things, where their mind may not rise to the occasion of attributing value to higher things. There's also the situation in which somebody that is quite sophisticated in their mental faculties may have quite lofty targets for their value and that which they feel satisfied for. If we move away from the scale of the importance of a behavior, I think we can also examine the good and evil that's associated with these, the ends that would be fulfilled by partaking in such a behavior. Part of that, I think, is dictated by our intention and the aspects of a particular experience or achievement that we are actually deriving satisfaction from. So, for example, when I had mentioned that I derive satisfaction from helping somebody, from seeing them through a situation for which I am responsible for assisting them through. I think it is appropriate to ask of myself, what parts of that experience do you find to be fulfilling? Is it only the parts where somebody else is giving you praise? Is it the part where the problem has been met by some adequate solution, such that goodness has been done? In the first instance, I think, while there may be, in my own experience that is, there may be some joy and elation that comes from that is coming from the praise of the person that I have assisted, I think it would be wrong to, at least in a totalizing sense, to internalize this and use this as the prideful end. Because now what we are really considering here is that the self, my own experience, my own desire to be recognized, but more broadly, myself as the centerpiece of that attentive exchange between two parties, it erodes my attention, it erodes my thinking, because I'm not necessarily rotating my attention around the problem to be solved. Even if I do solve it, I'm primarily rotating it around myself. And aside from eventually having problems becoming too difficult to solve because I'm only thinking about myself, I also have to wonder at what else is lost by such a limited perspective. Now, as I alluded to, I think within the human experience it's a little bit more complicated than that. It would seem that, at least in my experience, there's a bit of both happening. That is, there is this understanding, acceptance of one's praise, which provides me with that sense of achievement, that elation or satisfaction, which would be a prideful experience, internally prideful, selfish pride. But then there's also a component which I am thankful that there is a process by which I can come to understand something that is true. And by extension of solving this problem, be glad that somebody else has, almost like the externalized pride that I had mentioned before, this empathy, for which I am grateful for the achievement of somebody else. And I feel that sense of satisfaction for that achievement on their part. And so I think it is within the proper scaling. There's this scale of justice that appears in my mind that happens in this situation, in this example. So far, and I don't think that this is an exhaustive list of the experience, but so far there happens to be three things that are being considered on this scale of justice. That of the internalized pride, the selfish pride, for which I think danger exists. The empathetic pride, for somebody else's achievements. And then the type of satisfaction in the achievement and understanding, but it's more than just the achievement and understanding, because there seems to be a multiple domain even of this problem. That I can recognize that there's something that is satisfying in solving a problem. The question then arises, well, is the satisfaction because of your understanding, of my understanding, or is it a matter of appreciating an achievement of God, let's say? Now, I don't know why it's taken me so long to come to this. I was trying to think about, well, what else is there to say about the process that is? Of course, the process that is caused by God. So, I think that even within my own reasoning here, I've exposed a degree of selfishness that I need to recognize and fix, at least in my own estimation on this scale. And now I say that because if we are to think about this scale, and to think about it as reasonably as we can, what we would want to do is to be in good graces with, to be in communion with God, or the transcendent, because this would afford us with the most expansive experience. But again, there is this tricky thing about pride and about that relationship of what we should be valuing with regard to the self, and also with regard to things that are outside of the self, maybe not necessarily outside of the self, but are intimately related to the self. Now, just as an aside, I think pride is so dangerous because it resides so deeply and so close to the soul, that the soul being this vehicle and connection between the divine experience of reality and the more insular experience that the self can often shackle us to. And I think it's, at least in my mind, it's very easy to dip one's foot over into the opposite corridor, because they are so tightly wound, or perhaps I should say so tightly approximated. They're so close together. So getting back to the point, back to the scales of justice, we have our newfound satisfaction in God, in the achievements of God, and in God's creation. We have the selfish elevation, the selfish pride, and then we have the empathetic pride. To the best of my ability, adjudicating these, I would put God at the top, the empathy in the middle, and the pride, the selfish pride, last. Now there must be a reason for this ordering, and this reason should have some end. And so I think this is worth exploring. But before I do that, I'd like to remind us exactly where we are, because it can get quite deep into the weeds. But I want to remind us that we are being guided by a key to open the door. That is the proverb. That is Proverb number 12 of this chapter. See you a man wise in his own conceit? There is more hope of a fool than of him. Now, of conceit, it intimately is related to this concept of pride. The definition of conceit, excessive pride in oneself. So we have to understand the word pride to get back to conceit. And then from conceit, we have to go to wise, and then we can attempt to answer the question and then follow it up by the second half of the verse, which will give us clarification. But at this point, I want to ignore the second half of the verse. So another day has elapsed, and today happens to be a Friday evening. So it's a good day. It's always a nice feeling that the next day is going to be somewhat relaxing, or at the very least a break in the work routine. So let's get up to speed here. This business of pride, this business of satisfaction, of pleasure, of the view of the image of an achievement, of our relationship to it. And of the three distinctions. Directionally away from the self, towards the self, or towards God. Now I leave room open, like always, for other types of relating this experience, this prideful experience. But these are the three main ones that we are going off of here. So the question at hand is, how exactly can I justify placing these things in the hierarchy that I place them in? Again, that in terms of pride, pointing it towards God, pointing it towards the self, and then pointing it towards something else outside of the self. Again, the word outside I don't necessarily like. Away from the self. I think the first sub-question to answer that broader question is, what exactly causes, if there is a truth to be had about ordering these things, what would cause the structure of that which is to provide us with such a distinction of importance? If we are to come to some reasonable conclusion for which this is something that is more than just arbitrary assignment, that there can actually be some strong logical basis for seeing the representation of pride and its manifestations in this way. How can we see this? I think the most important thing is to start with the top. So if we are to be fundamentally beings that value or find deep satisfaction, pleasure in the achievements of God, what does that mean? What does it mean for God to achieve something? For I think it could be said that to achieve something is to have some meaningful work be done. And if all that we know, all that we interface with, is to be meaningful work, then all of that which we see is to be met with this satisfaction that something successful has been done, has been created, in the sense that it is able to be perceived by us. But of course, as I've mentioned earlier, it is not the situation, even though we achieve many things throughout the day. For example, just taking myself at this moment, sitting here, I am saying words, I am saying sentences, and they are somewhat coherent. And yet, I wouldn't necessarily be proud of what I have said in the past few seconds. I haven't really come to a solid conclusion. While it may be some sort of achievement that something is done successfully, that I have mustered up the strength, and I have utilized the oxygen within my lungs, forced it through the airways, and manipulated sounds with my mouth, with my tongue, with my lips, and again coordinated that with my mind to articulate my thoughts. That is an achievement to a degree, and the more one thinks about it, the more one may come to an understanding of its beauty, that man can even do anything approaching such a thing. But given our normal everyday experience, this would not necessarily be considered an achievement. There is a way that we can see it, surely, as I've just said, that would allow us to appreciate it, to respect it, to be satisfied with something so simple. And I think that there is something there that I'll return to in a moment, but I have a broader point. Earlier I brought up a different example about using the restroom. And while this behavior, this action, is an achievement, again, it is something that is done, it is something that is regular, it is something that must be done, and there are certain contextual restraints that maybe afford is not the right word, but that prompt us not necessarily into that mode of prideful consideration. It is not something that we are particularly one way or another about. It is something that is done because it must be. But the interesting thing is that this exists on a continuum of various actions and various behaviors that scale up in terms of what we consider to be valuable. And at a certain point, we call something an achievement. It seems a bit arbitrary, but I think that the reason that it feels or seems to be arbitrary is because of the very fact that this continuum exists, and that if we are to define an achievement that is something that is typically done successfully, but requires maybe a degree of effort or skill to do, we say, well, just like I had mentioned about the business of speaking, of articulating thoughts, it is quite a sophisticated mechanism. And I suppose we could say the same about going to the bathroom, about relieving ourselves in that way. But it is a matter of mind that we generally think of something as an achievement. Even if it is a physical task, it is something that is brought into being because of the mind's exploration into the possibility of what can be. And so putting aside the potential arbitrary nature of what we might consider something to be an achievement, the important thing that I want to be, or to have known here, is that in terms of my thinking, I'm going to continue this achievement space on this continuum, but also recognize that culturally, or if I were to invite my close friends in here, or even anybody off of the street, even my coworkers, whatever, we had a discussion about what an achievement would be, there would be various examples to show what we consider to be an achievement. Some of us may debate about whether or not something is actually an achievement, but generally they would probably follow similar lines. Having their child, graduating a particular educational program, any number of significant life events that are positive, that again require this sort of skill and effort to achieve. Assuming that most of us experience life this way, and that it is not just a contemporary cultural thing, that throughout the ages we have always understood certain events in life to be the types of achievements where we might feel some sense of pride. I wonder at a couple of things. I wonder first and foremost, since we are trying to understand if this ordering that I have proposed is actually something that is worth keeping, that these achievements, in what way can we examine an achievement that would cause us to be prideful in the utmost sense, prideful in the sense that we are intensely thankful, satisfied with the product of God's creation, if it is to be said that in fact everything that we are able to intuit, understand, is a part of God's creation. And that all of the goodness that we perceive is also a part of God's creation, and also, I suppose, the opposite. Both in the broad context, big picture, big story sense. And then secondly, I wonder at a different type of cultural vision that would not be too unfamiliar to the scientifically minded people that are fascinated by the simplistic. Not necessarily simplistic in the sense of material or physical simplicity, because often the microscopic can be quite complex, but simple in the sense that the way that we usually interface with the world, we don't necessarily immediately gravitate towards that unseen level and all of the intricacies that occur there, because it is in fact unseen. What is generally seen to us is afforded by what our bodies can take in from the environment, all of the various sensors that we have. And of course the big Pandora's box of mind throws a big wrench into that system, for we can imagine all sorts of different things. We can come to understand things for which the body and its sensors are unable to immediately provide us. And so this wondering about the cultural question, and about the question, or the statement rather, that I proposed earlier, that if we are to imagine that everything that we see is a part of this broader divine order. And our sense of achievement, or our sense of, rather, the empathetic achievement, but the extension of the empathetic achievement towards the divinity, for which we seemingly don't directly know, but we participate in, and much like the scientific situation, in which the mind is prompted to consider processes that are beyond the immediate perception of man, but involve his ingenuity, his creativity, his rationality. I have to also wonder about that of the spiritual domain, about that of our meaningful expressions, about language, about this continuum of what we consider to be an achievement. And although in one light the simplistic may seem quite simple to us, maybe on an empathetic level, or on the level of the heart, but much like our understanding of the body and its physical sensors and the limitations therein, I think perhaps that culture also is a thing that perhaps is a bit more susceptible to evolution than the body, or at least it's quicker to evolve than the body and the physical substructure. But all the same, I imagine a situation, especially a situation now in our current culture, the United States in 2024, what a strange thing, that our sense of achievement, that our appreciation for things may change, it may become more sophisticated, in the sense that the things perhaps that we had once took for granted, now we feel a little bit more connected to these things. Not that everything that we do ought to invoke this profound sense of satisfaction that we have done something. I don't mean to suggest that we should all devolve ourselves into personal pride, for after all, we must remember that I'm talking about the first, about the divine pride. But I think that we should give, I think that I should give more of my conscious experience, of my attentive capacity to God and to thankfulness, to be thankful for the achievements that are all around me. And I think the more that this sort of thing is practiced, the less I am focused on myself, the less that I am exposed to the possibility of attributing this intense satisfaction for my own inner doing, like I am actually the creator of something that has been given to me as a tool. And it's quite an intricate relationship, I think, the pride within and the pride to God. Because the pride within, I'm skipping the empathetic pride here, but I don't think that matters all that much. And I hope that I am continuing to make some logical sense here. When I dive from that divine prideful sense down to the individual internal prideful sense, or close proximity prideful sense, in which that thing that I say that I am, as it can be just me, disconnected from other things that are, which of course I will have to make the preface that I do not believe that an identity can exist outside from God's identity, independent of anything else. We can call something an identity of its own and give it characteristics for which we can identify something. Just like this book that's in front of me, it is the Bible. It has an identity, it has a physical structure. but its physical structure does not exist in a vacuum of things that are. It requires a certain environment to exist. It has been heavily modified by our experience. We have brought down the heavenly component to bring its material condition up to meet our ends, to fulfill our desires and our purposes. But fundamentally, its existence depends on various other identities and the interplay between things. For this thing that's in front of me was at one time a much different material object. Its identity would have been completely different. If I had seen it in the forest somewhere, I would not recognize this thing that would then become the Bible, with all of the words that are written into it and all of the meaning that I'm trying to extract from it. But going back to what I was saying about considering myself this strange being that has this physical form, but also this spiritual component, the mind that perhaps tries to make sense of its existence by giving itself a self, so that it can look out for the material thing that allows it, or that facilitates its existence. Often, verses prompt one to consider the orientation of the self relative to other identities. A very useful, thought-provoking exercise in many domains. And also the relationship of our reason and our feelings and our desires, that from the first chapter on is a constant within this book. And now that we've been through a substantial portion of it, and we've gone through these exercises over and over and over again, what seems to be becoming more and more clear is that allow me for a moment to do an exercise to consolidate and put some pieces together. In my mind, I see an image. I see an image of myself, but it is not a material or physical representation of myself. It is more of myself in the mental domain, in the cognitive sphere. It is an image of something that is. It's an identity. An identity for which I've stripped my physical form. And I've done that in an attempt to disconnect what would be otherwise a very limiting, selfish conception of my own identity. And as I see it in this space, I see around it, without too much detail in terms of understanding exactly how it interacts with these things, but what I see around it is other identities. Other identities, many of them have physical form, which is, again, hard to separate, but the room that I am in, there is nothing that is natural about this place. Everything has been touched by human hands. Everything has been built for some purpose. And so it's quite easy, actually, to close my eyes and to consider about the things that have identities around me, despite them not being conscious agents in the way that I am. It's easy to see how these things are interacting with the mind that is stripped from the body's pull towards a particular type of experience, a particular type of identity. And that's not to say that I'm trying to dissolve my identity. It is rather to see it in a different light. To see it in a different light so I can understand how it relates to other things. In the same way that we choose to see on the scientific, using the scientific toolkit, things that are beyond our immediate perception, and yet are every bit a part of this world. So the important question, the whole point of this exercise is to ask the question, well, what do you see? Why is this a useful exercise? What I see, in some sense, is heavily influenced by my desires, by my will. And I say that because there are many things around me that are tools for my exploration, things that I could spend my time on, things that I can consume, things that I can build. It is much like a sandbox, I suppose. And so in this way, there's a picture that emerges that is somewhat disheartening, because it is, out of all the things that are in this room, they all serve the self. They all serve the satisfaction of that selfish pride. And that there is nothing, I should not say nothing, but there's an aspect of the way that I have chosen to see things for so long, I think, that I almost see them in a selfish, prideful manner. That these things, that these tools are here to serve me, rather than for me to use these things to serve God. And I think that this is a part of an issue in my life. It's something that I need to change. So I'd like to recap and cover what exactly had been explored here. I think, at least I hope, this demonstrates a degree of what I mean by this hierarchy of the prideful experience as it exists in man, up to God and then down to the selfish, insular, limiting experience. Of our experience and of the way in which we choose to participate in the world, I think we ought to give. We ought to liberate where things ought to be liberated rather than to subject. But of course, this sort of dynamic is always frustrating, because there's always subjection in the proper place, but also liberation in the proper place. Sometimes, as I think that I have just uncovered for myself, the direction, the feelings of the heart, the market that the feelings satisfy, being the heart, this industrial machine that produces emotions, if all of the consumers wish to participate and to consume products in a particular type of way, the producers of those products are going to produce them for the producers, because that's where the value is, that's where the mind is. Or rather, I should say the producers will produce the product for the consumer. But it is not until the consumer says, oh, wait a minute, perhaps the way that I'm consuming myself is actually destructive to my experience and my relationship to God, then I think I begin to see things in a way that, and participate in things in a way that become more productive, that satisfy creation as it is, because it doesn't take much to spur a creative thought or a poetic image of something that the mind considers to be rich with value all around. This sort of example of Eden as this paradise that surrounds man. This state prior to the corruption of his soul, of his mind. It seems that we live in Eden, but it's a matter of not seeing it because of the way in which we think, the way in which I choose to see myself in relationship to the experience that I've been given, the life that I've been given. So, I don't necessarily think we need to go into the middleman here, the empathy towards the other individual, or the agent that is away from the self, because this is a continuum all the way up to God. I think there are many benefits to thinking away from the self towards another agent, but also even more benefits to be thinking away from the self towards that divine entity that connects things, that provides us with the ability to connect things together. See you a man wise in his own conceit? So the next object of our consideration here is to explore the term wise. Now, the word wise is deeply grounded in our perception, is deeply grounded in the idea of knowing something, of making strong and proper judgments. But also, I think, recognizing relationships, recognizing patterns, recognizing what connects things together, what binds things together. And so it would seem that we have a contradiction in terms here. See you a man that is wise in his own conceit. Now, of course, this term conceit can be seen as an additive to pride. It is this negative. It is an intensifier. It's an excessive pride. It's the pride that goes beyond that which would bring us closer to that divine peak, towards unity, towards proper unity, perhaps I should say. And instead it brings us to something of a blinding, of a place where we can no longer see the relationships between things. We can no longer understand the broader context. And so for a wise man, and so for somebody that is conceited, for such a person to gain wisdom out of this would seem to be impossible. Because we're talking about something, again, that does not afford wisdom. It is the opposite of it. There is more hope of a fool than of him. It's interesting here. I've been thinking a little bit about how I should go about progressing what we've already talked about. I think most of the work of the verse here is done. However, there are a few more important bits of this that I think that we need to discuss before we move on. There is an interesting progression in thought that comes from the second half of this verse. Since the previous 11 verses have been talking about the character of the fool, of what he is, how we can conceptualize of him, now what we have here is a statement saying that the prideful person, in the negative sense, is actually worse than the fool. For there is more hope in the fool than that of the person who feels that he is wise in his own conceit. Now the fool, again, as we have discussed, is somebody that, much like the outcomes of the prideful person, may be blinded by this, that, and the other. The foolish person is profoundly inattentive, and this is primarily the cause of their unfortunate lack of understanding. But what I find interesting here is that the self-deceptive component, that of the person who is obviously not wise by the fact that they are lost within their conceit, is considering themselves to be wise. There's a step up. There is this delusion that rests atop of the original pathology, that of the negative pride, which in and of itself is a foolish thing, a foolish thought, a foolish expression. But to consider oneself wise is such a misrepresentation of that which is true. It demonstrates, I think, a lack of the ability to problem solve through one's own conception of themselves, that they think of themselves so highly that their identity to them exceeds that of truth. And of course, this is a dangerous thing. Once we elevate things above truth, or that which is, we find ourselves in a delusion. Again, this is foolish territory. But to stack on top of that vanity, and to call one's failures an insight that allows one to see all of reality clearly, maybe not all of reality, but there's a certain sense in which the wise person understands things globally, understands large patterns, and they base their decisions on these large patterns. And the wise person, if they are truly wise, their actions are often commensurate with their understanding being true. And such a breach of this characterization, it seems to me to be narcissistic, autoaxial, in the sense that the self is the divine source. And it's not the case that I think that the mistake is the thing that is necessarily wrong. We all make mistakes, and make them every day. It's the fact that the individual in question is unwilling to see beyond their own error. And I have to think at a certain point, especially when we're talking about wisdom, once one gets to that point, and they are so prideful, it should be readily apparent to everybody. But only those that are sick with some pathology of mind, like an alcoholic, for example, that even in the grip of that addiction, even if it brings them to a hospital bed, for which their abdomen is bloated with fluid and the liver fails to function as it ought to, there is this denial that their behavior has led to their current condition. This is a type of conceit, surely. But I would not necessarily say that this is a person who believes that wisdom is born of that conceit. It is just a foolish person. If I had to extend that analogy out, I would have to imagine that the person that is on their hospital bed because of their alcoholism would say that because of their drinking, they are in a better place, and that what brings them to the hospital can impossibly be connected to alcoholism because of the fact that they have come to understand so much through their experience with that addiction. And for most people, hearing such an explanation would bring us a sense of sorrow, and bring us a sense of empathy. We would all feel, I would feel, a bit bad for this person. It's an unfortunate person. Now, for my own part, I've spoken of my own foolishness. But as I think about whether or not I have gone to the extreme of being wise in my conceit, I would have to think about it. The younger me surely has felt and said many things that I would cringe at today as an adult, that is a relatively productive member of society. But I must think about myself now, as this experience is an attempt to broaden my faith and improve myself as a person. You know, as I go through my life, there are things that prop me up, and sometimes I wonder, sometimes I consider whether the things that I hold behind my thoughts as I go through the day are truly things that ought to be holding me. A sort of a contrarian's mindset, a healthy skepticism about the things that I think that I understand, about the way that I think that I ought to be in the presence of others, or in relationship to my friends or family. Now, foolish behavior, I accept that. I accept that there will always be situations in which a fool will pop his head up out of the dirt and make his presence known. However hard I may try to keep him away, keep him within the closet that he necessarily must rest. But I will say, in the absence of thinking about a particular example, that a commitment I think that should be made by myself and and to many who wish to avoid this sort of thing, is to prompt the mind to consider this discussion that we've had about pride, about the good aspects and about the potential negatives of it. To consider conceit as an excessive form of pride that follows a negative path, that leads one to that selfishness, that blinds the mind to experiencing things away from the self. That if the attention is always on the self and propping the self up on this pedestal, for which, regardless of what experience or what event may occur, the mind is always thinking about that in relation to how it is perceived, or how that thing on the pedestal can benefit from it. I think this erodes the experience of life. It erodes the experience of life because the heart is not able to express, is not able to give. The self becomes small. It becomes brittle and weak. Its boundaries are minute, well-defined in the negative sense. The slothful man says, "There's a lion in the way. A lion is in the streets." Now this is a verse that we've seen before, if I'm not mistaken, on more than one occasion. Perhaps not in exactly the same words, but the sentiment is the same. The imagery of the lion is the same. So another opportunity to reflect on this statement then. So here we are prompted to consider what the slothful man is. In the broad sense, I think what we are being prompted to consider is that laziness extends quite far. It's more than just laziness, I think, in the sloth. But we will get to that. It extends so far as to say that even our ideas about that which plagues us, if it be something that many of us would consider to be an obstacle beyond our strength, if we do nothing, and all we do is say that something is negative or disappointing or frightening, we still find ourselves in the space of inaction, a space of weakness and of laziness. Now it's interesting that we move from the fool to the sloth, because I think that the two are intimately related. Starting with the sloth, though, I think about the animal, the poor creature. But the sloth is an animal that is slow, physically a slow animal. And the type of imagery that it produces, as we'd apply it to the human context, is of a person that is not very ambitious. A person that chooses to sleep in, or their diet is geared towards foods of comfort rather than foods of health, and that their leisure activities involve being sedentary rather than being active. Passive experience of life rather than attentive experience. Now, a simple Google definition of the word slothful reveals the word lazy, as I had mentioned. But what I find equally as interesting is the synonyms to this word: idle, insolent, work-shy, inactive, inert, sluggish, apathetic. Now, like I did with the fool, I would like to find where, perhaps what, the slothful person looks like within the mind, the space that they inhabit, the character that makes up their identity. From this situation, I would like to extend this out and find the slothful man within me and try to come to some conclusion, some way in which I can understand how to improve my own condition, my own behavior. So let's go then. Let's walk down this long hallway for which we see a door at the end. And this door is locked to us, but we have the key. We have, of the Proverbs of chapter 26, we have the key of verse 13 to open this door. Now, as I turn the handle, and as the door swings upon its hinges, I see something in front of me. I see an environment. I am experiencing a feeling. But what I see is something a bit discomforting, because I recognize it. I recognize it as being a part of me, an aspect of myself that I don't necessarily wish to face, wish to own up to. It's a weakness of sorts, this character. Almost like looking in a mirror, but except seeing myself, I see, again, an aspect of myself. It's a mirror of partiality. And the partial aspects of me that I see, of course, are the slothful character. Now, I said that I wish to explore the sloth independently and then my own experience, but I'm not sure I'm able to do that at the moment. You know, I wonder at times when I fall into this space of inattentiveness and of desire to do nothing and to think about nothing. And I may put on some auditory stimulus to numb my mind from boredom or from thinking about something that would cause me to exert more effort or energy, which undoubtedly probably would happen, left to its own devices. Because for whatever reason, the pain of continuing after a period of sustained thought or sustained physical activity, the fatigue really wears the mind down. And it's more than just fatigue, the slothful character. The slothful character is strong in the face of fatigue, because it's a tempting character. but it can also be quite strong in situations where we are confronted by no responsibility, by having time that is open and available to us. Now, for the most part, I think most productive minds would view this situation as a positive, as something that is an opportunity that they can take to get something done and to fill that space with anything but the slothful person, slothful character, I should say. And for my part, I try my best to do it when I'm presented with such situations, circumstances. However, not every time that this happens am I presented with such a clear and readily, joyfully, perhaps, acceptable path towards productive ends. There is something about the origin is uncertain, but there is something about what the mind wishes, what aspects of the mind wishes, and what other aspects of the mind wish. And often there is a conflict between the two. The conflict causes friction. In the best case scenario, there is no disagreement, and that the desires of my being are nothing other than productive ends. But there are other times which I undoubtedly encounter, more frequent than I would like, where the slothful character returns, telling me that you deserve to take time off. Your mind needs a rest. What you wish to accomplish can wait. It can be put off. And in certain situations, the mind does need a rest. But at those moments, there really is no hesitation, and it is not a matter of temptation. It is a matter of necessity. Matter of temptation is a matter in which what is being offered, the pleasing aroma, the satisfying fulfillment, is something that is extra. It is not needed to perpetuate a good life or a feeling of well-being. And in fact, the slothful character begins to suggest that because the productive ends begin with a path of pain and suffering, that it is because of this that you ought to see it as a negative and not pursue it. But of course, everything has pain. Everything involves suffering to a degree. It is a sacrifice. Productive ends require sacrifice. There's something about the image of an inert agent, an inert human agent, as something that has such a capacity to design, to wonder, to create, and yet it is bound by leisure, but leisure of the negative sort, of superficiality, of that which would cause him to see time as something that he could just coast on, rather than something that he needs to take advantage of and to use sparingly, because it is truly valuable to him. The slothful man says, There's a lion in the way. A lion is in the streets. Now, a lion is quite the symbol. It's a symbol of power. It's a symbol of strength. It is a symbol of cunning, perhaps. It is a beast. But as we imagine this morphing figure that's in front of us, with its physical connotations, it immediately becomes something, as I've said, it's morphing. It is unstable in its nature. It requires our experiences, it requires our thought to give it a form to occupy that space beyond just that of the lion, but of the qualities that constitute it, and of power and of strength and of the beast. A man can be afraid of all of these things in more ways than one. He could be reserved to confront such things within himself, such things that may physically be in front of him that he must conquer. Things that exist within the mental domain, the intelligible sphere, a difficult conversation, a difficult step in life that one must take to move to the next step, a difficult sacrifice. All of these things are rooted in that interplay between strength, power, and that beast for which we are fearful to conquer, because it would cost us quite greatly. In the case of confronting a lion, it would seem that we would need quite a lofty purpose to do such a thing. For surely, the probability of conquering that lion in the streets is against us, but it is not zero. But the good thing about the many lions that we face in our day-to-day is that the mind is this eternal thing, and as we are here to experience it, we can sacrifice many aspects of it. Where the body and the physical confrontation of the lion, our whole conscious experience is at stake, the stakes are much higher. But of those situations that we encounter every day, again, a difficult conversation, a call to be strong, a call for one to demonstrate authority, and to conquer that beast that stands in front of them. The man that is confronted, in my mind, is this sort of effervescing, if that's the right word, or steaming individual, and off of this, in this spiritual manner, this imagery, for which it also could be akin to a flame that comes from him. That this burst of energy is out into the nothingness, into the ether. But it's that strong, meaningful core that serves to regenerate and rejuvenate our being, our purpose, our desires, our strength. When we encounter situations that we fail, when we encounter that situation, the beast that subdues us when we try and subdue it, what we are sacrificing is not the core of ourselves. We are sacrificing the periphery. And although the periphery may be a part of ourself, it is not something that will not return again in the future. And because of this situation, it ought not to be the case that man should reserve himself to the idle nature for fear of this peripheral damage. We all must undergo numerous experiences, numerous challenges and hardship to improve our strength and be robust against the lion that is in the streets. And so, as I've mentioned at the outset, the way in which I see this verse is that the slothful man is in confronting, whether it be a literal lion in the part of his city for which he must be responsible for protecting the vulnerable, or in a much broader situation in which the lion is symbolic of everything that we fear to confront, whether it be physical or immaterial concepts, conversations, relationships, professional duties. And this lion that is in the way, there's no use in saying it this way. Because saying it in this way is to offload the responsibility of the situation onto somebody else, an ear that might hear it. But of course, for all things that truly matter, there's only two ears that hear such a cry from within. It's our own and that of the divine. A lion is in the streets. That causeway for which we travel, for which the flow of information, the infrastructure that carries us to and fro, the medium through which we can conduct business, to carry on our lives, to manage the various goings-on and the complicated nature of the heart, of our reason. Everything flows in this street. For it to be obstructed is no small matter. For us not to be able to communicate or to attend to reality is the worst thing that we can imagine. Because outside of death, the situation is a prison for the mind. To be afraid such that our mind, our attention, our desires cannot surpass that thing that is immediately in front of us. It causes us to stagnate, to become idle, to regress, and to become weak, to atrophy in mind and body. There's only one way to continue in life. It is to confront that lion in the street. And there are 101 ways of doing so. There are another 101 ways of failing to do it. But it is a matter of faith, it would seem, to continue to strive and to attempt to clear the road of danger so that we can continue in peace. As the door turns upon its hinges, so does the slothful upon the bed. So today is a new day. And in fact, yesterday I had lost my recording. So I'll have to cover some ground that was lost, recover that ground. In yesterday's recording, I had mentioned that I'm at the beginning of a summer cold, which is always a not so welcome event. But despite feeling a bit unwell, I would like to continue to be productive. It happens to be a Wednesday evening. We are entering into the latter half of the week, and there's always something a bit sweet about this time in the week, that things are, hopefully, in the mind at least, beginning to wind down, prepare for that time of rest, prepare for the Sabbath day. Of course, there are still 2 days left in the week, which is no small portion. But there's just something comforting knowing that the end is approaching. And of course, as the end comes, my mind will not let me take too much time to recover. It is a time to put forth a different type of energy, a different type of labor, that of self-study, of exercise, all of the disciplines that are necessary to maintain my composure. So beginning with the first half of this verse, the first thing that stands out to me is the pronoun that is given to this door, as if the door is an agent, as the door turns upon his hinges. The imagery here, we know, as a consequence of the second half of the verse, what it's referring to. But this conversation about the axis has come up more than once in the Proverbs. At least we are prompted in that general direction. And as I go through my mind and I sift through my memories, what I think about is the hearth. What I think about is the Platonic opposites, that we may find something good to revolve around, to orient our attention to, but there is always something in which we can find ourselves attending to that will not provide us with good outcomes, that will not connect us to other people. It will not strengthen our relationships. It will do just the opposite. And unlike previous examples, as I've mentioned, in the Proverbs where we're prompted to consider the hearth-like axis, for which, in the home of a family, and in the fractal sense, how that might scale up in terms of a community, of a state, and of a broader, connected, governing body. The hearth is a place that people gather around. What they do when they're there, it depends on them. But that hearth has power. It has power to draw, to bind people together. Assuming that this thing that binds people is good, then I think that the relational aspect of that experience will be good. If what brings us together is discussions of goodness, discussions of our own experience with goodness, discussions or reflections on how we may have failed or have sinned, all of this, I think, is productive. Then it opens the mind to the aspects of self that can go by the wayside if we just sort of set ourselves on autopilot for most of our conscious experience. But on the other side of that dreadful coin, we find that door upon his hinge, that it is an axis of rotation around which one's attention is oriented, the door being that identity, being the body of the individual, the axis being what he chooses, how he chooses to be, where he chooses again to put his mind. And what he finds in this experience as a door on the hinge is an agent that is shackled to a particular way. Not to be careful with my language here, because the way in and of itself, there are many different paths in life. The way in and of itself may not necessarily be bad. It may bring us to a poor conclusion, but there's nothing wrong with learning, assuming that problem that was the failure to solve a problem, assuming that failure was not extreme enough where one cannot be saved, then it's okay. It's okay for a man to find out the effects of indolence, assuming that he hasn't wrecked his life because of it. And as long as there is the ounce of will left to sacrifice that part of himself towards something greater, for a stronger axis of rotation that he could place his attention, then it's not all for naught. But if we are to examine the immediate situation in which a person may be stuck in this situation, or myself as an individual, as I may experience slivers of this during my day or on the weekends when I am supposed to be productive, but something happens and I fall into this laziness. Additionally, I think we can examine the possibility of this axis extending out fractally, where our lives can be broken down in the plane that they operate in, the play that that unfolds, that is our life. And given a particular occupation or a particular experience that we spend most of our time doing, this is why I mentioned the occupation. So I'm thinking specifically about my experience here, that I go to work. Today, for example, I woke up at 5. I began working at about 5:30. I get ready to go in to work at around 9:10. I left at 9:50. Got to work at 10:10. And I worked until 7:30. That's a lot of time to be spending at a place. That's a lot of time to be spending doing something. That's an axis around which my attention rotates. That's time that's away from what I'm doing now, being reflective and engaging with the Proverbs in the Bible. This is also an axis. And so while we can examine our lives, I think, in these segments, we can also say, of the segment, of the time that I spent today, and of the overall decision that I have made for this occupation, is this axis long-term going to be something where I can facilitate continual growth and grow as a person? That this axis is not a shackle, but rather a teacher and a facilitator. But the difficult thing, as I think about my own experiences here, both of the slothful axis and that of the facilitatory axis, the facilitatory axis is not something that we could just grab onto like we can grab onto the slothful axis. The slothful axis is welcoming. It's almost like falling asleep. It's natural. And perhaps not in every situation, but in many situations. That axis for which we are productive and produce and externalize value. This takes effort. It takes work. I think the work and effort in and of itself can become pleasurable, but often it's not something that is immediately gratifiable. Now, in certain situations also, I will say that the slothful behavior is actually quite discomforting to individuals. And the extremes of each are probably quite uncomfortable. We all land at a certain place. But regardless of where we are, I think, thinking again about my own experience, it requires my attention to move one place to another. And if one is trying to be strong in the things that they believe, trying to put their best foot forward, trying to make a good impression, trying to make a good connection with another person, that takes effort, that takes time, it takes commitment to saying certain things that one might not be comfortable saying, accepting responsibility that one might not be comfortable accepting. And part of that accepting that responsibility, I think, means admitting where one is wrong, but also keeping the mind going and active, not falling back into a passive way of being, but maintaining that energy level such that the productive capacity can manifest in the world. And I think this sort of thing is a facilitatory axis. So with regard to interpersonal situations, relationships, approaching people often begins at different places. We all ascend the mountain of life towards the divine peak from different places. But again, fractally speaking, if we just zoom in, move down on that scale, think about our own interactions with other people. This is a sort of a mountainous landscape in and of itself. Each one of these interactions begins somewhere else. Sometimes it begins at a place with a solid context for which we have a strong footing, for which we can move up towards goodness. Other times the footing is weak, and it's difficult to grasp a hold of anything, to make any shift or change. But regardless of the situation, now again thinking of my own occupation, I have so many experiences of this day after day after day, even hour to hour, that it takes a lot of, to do it well, I should say, it takes a lot of effort to show people a side of things that is productive. Because first and foremost, I, myself, have to know where the productive place is. If I'm going to lead, if I'm going to facilitate, then I have to know what I am revolving around, moving towards, pointing my attention to. And I say, this is what I see, this is where we should go. For somebody to follow me, there are certain things that must be put into place. I must build trust. I must say things that are appropriate given the situation, valuable given the situation. And on the flip side, when the sloth comes in, I feel like there's an even more nuanced way to see this. Because within, let's say, somebody accepts something, some responsibility. And within that responsibility, they can do something to reach a particular end or goal. There may be one person that really overachieves. Maybe that's not the right word. No, it's definitely not the right word. There may be one person that is really attentive at solving a particular solution. Now, it doesn't mean the way that they solve the problem is going to be correct. But the intensity of the approach, I think, is undeniable. And then there's also what I've been calling that passive approach, for which the sloth, as a sort of a being of temptation, comes in and says, okay, you've accepted this responsibility. It's good enough. You're a responsible person. Now you can sit back and coast. I think this is a aside from the truly slothful behavior. This is a form of slothfulness that operates under the guise of being productive, and I think it's equally as dangerous. Now, what I called the true form of slothfulness, I think this is fairly straightforward. It is that type of inattentiveness, inertness, in which the mind commits itself to almost nothing productive. It's a state that is almost adjacent to being asleep. Now, being asleep is productive in the sense that you're recharging in a way, but of my experience with this type of slothful behavior, it manifests in passive attention. It manifests in very low levels of responsibility. And the outcomes that it leads to is a profound distraction in what the more scientifically minded individuals may say is a dopamine deficit. And in these types of situations, it's hard to climb out of the inattentive rabbit hole. As the door turns upon his hinges, so does the slothful upon his bed. Like the sloth is affixed to that, as I've just mentioned, that state of rest, that sleepful state, that he is never satisfied by it. He is always consuming it. And whereas I think many of us at a certain point, it doesn't feel good anymore to lay in bed. We have to get out and do something. We have to earn the rest that is ahead of us. And in fact, in my experience, it feels better if one is able to push in a productive manner so hard and so far that the rest feels like a precious gift. That sleeping for even an hour is something that I would be extremely thankful for. And I can only pray that I am able to be strong enough to be able to achieve that sort of thing. The slothful hides his hand in his bosom. It grieves him to bring it again to his mouth. So this is an interesting verse. The slothful hides his hand in his bosom. So there's an image here. There's an image that we are prompted to consider of hiding and of the relationship to the chest. Now, when I think of the chest, or the bosom of a man, I think of an area that is located just above the heart. The heart being this symbol of rich significance in the Proverbs. We've spoken of it many times in the history of this podcast. I'm sure there are a few different roads that we can go down here in terms of the word bosom. Of course, there's a male context here, but in the sense of the feminine, there is the thought of the nurturing component, that of the bosom being providing nutrition to an infant, but all the same, as I've mentioned, it represents that nurturing element. So I think as a composite, we should probably take the heart as this symbolic structure, this rich symbolic structure. Often I've referred to it as the seat of our emotions and our desires, that factory that produces our feelings and emotions to satisfy, to wed themselves to our thoughts, to our experiences, to our memories. But also, as I've mentioned, perhaps integrating this nurturing component is the word that is used, although I suppose can be used in both gendered contexts. But it's something that I imagine is mostly used in the female context. Either way, I think we're approaching that general direction when a slothful person hides their hand close to their chest. And perhaps there's another few roads that we can find here, but I suppose that will come in time. Another thing that I think we must break down is the symbol of the hand. Now, perhaps to state the obvious, our hands are an extension of ourselves, but there are many things that we can consider an extension of ourself, some in more interesting ways than others. In my mind, it brings the thought of, or it brings a question rather, well, exactly where are we starting in terms of this reference point of where the self is? If one is to say that the hand is an extension of the self, then of course it is somewhat removed from the core of that thing that I consider myself to be. And I suppose, like many things, there are different ways that we could start classifying the self. Who I am, in certain situations, would be considered all of me, including my physical body. If I'm speaking philosophically, if I'm speaking spiritually, then who I am transcends the physical form that I possess. I suppose to a degree it's not independent of it, but it's still, the mind still affords the possibility of speaking of the self in terms that are somewhat distinct. That is, terms of the physical and then terms of the intelligible or of the mind. And as I think about the hand is this physical structure. It is not something within it that has the capacity to think, but it has the capacity to do under the authority of the mind. It is the subordinate to the mind. And it performs actionable things. We could say that it is an extension of our thoughts, an extension of our heart, since both of these are subsets of what I would consider to be mind. Moving away from that, perhaps in a different direction, maybe in a different, if we think about the y-axis on a graph, if we are to move in the negative y, I think we move, well, I'll say that we move, just for reference, to the physical domain, more physical, more material. And as we move into the positive y direction, we move into the immaterial, the conscious sphere, the meaning sphere. And in the positive y direction, as opposed to the hand being an extension of the self, I would say in the positive y direction, we have the spirit, which is this sort of ethereal projection. Now, that's a very loose language. I've spoken of the spirit before in differing terms and using different analogies. An analogy that I like to use often, although I'm not entirely sure it's comprehensive, is that of a fire, except those of us in the Midwest will understand this experience, but in the fall, there are often people that burn their leaves in their yards. But usually, we cannot see the fire. But we know what is happening because we can smell it. We know what that smell is. And although we can't necessarily see the fullness of that thing that is burning, and that is the process that is actually giving rise to our perception of what that thing is, the spirit is similar. It is something that I think we can experience and we take in through our senses as we have them, but sometimes, let's say from my point of view to another person, myself sensing the spirit of another, it is often difficult to fully see the mechanism in place. For even of a fire, there are mechanisms for which we cannot see, and yet they unfold. There is only a select number or select amount of information that we take in to encapsulate that entire experience. Now, of the spirit that we experience sort of intrapersonally, I suppose we can identify it more firmly because this is grounded in our experience. We know it better. We are the ones that have actually started the fire, to stay consistent with the analogy. And so we can feel it burn, we see it burn, and we can smell it. But it is an aspect of being that is an extension, much like the hand, of the meaningful aspect of ourselves, the purposeful, willful, directed nature of ourselves. The soul is the fundament. That is the thing that allows us to feel, have the capacity to connect us to something, or a feeling of something that is much broader and greater than ourselves. It is much like the plug in the matrix, for which we are endowed with this natural ability to perceive and to be aware of ourselves and our position relative to other things that are. And aside from something just being an object that is, we are an object that is, that has self-awareness, that has a degree of individual agency. And so that leaves us in a unique position to examine other things and our own place in the broader structure of that thing. And I think all of this is important because it's often the case that we have to understand or see a broad map, or at least outline one briefly, since we're not directly prompted to consider some of these things, so that we could then place this verse into something so that it holds, it actually makes some sense to us. But returning to this idea of the hand, again, we're in the material domain, physical domain, maybe I should say, but this is something uniquely connected to us, uniquely connected to the self, to the seat of being. Now, just as an aside, there are a few different ways that I've considered the soul. Sometimes I've described it, even the spirit, sometimes as the seat of being. And so I don't necessarily want to create undue confusion. Language will find itself where it needs to be. We will find ourselves producing as much as meaning and value as we can out of this verse, and so I'll try my best to place it where appropriate. But again, the hand, this extension of meaningful action, willful action in the world. It's representative of a lot. Our behaviors tell us, or rather I should say that they tell others, they reveal to us and others, uniquely enough, bizarrely enough, our true intention. And I say both situations in terms of reveal to others, but also ourselves, because sometimes, even to myself, I was thinking today about an experience that I had the other day, a casual experience with some coworkers after work. And I had to wonder about some loose language that I had used, and not necessarily bad in any way, but I wonder how it's perceived in the broader context of who I am, and if it was actually representative of who I am. And when I had said it and I submitted that behavior into the external environment, one must question themselves and say, well, is this but an aspect of me? Is this something that I truly am? Now, inevitably, I come to the conclusion that one particular behavior is not enough to outline the entire map of an individual to understand who they are. But regardless, there are interesting bits of information that we can draw from behavior, both unexpected from the subjective standpoint or the personal standpoint, individual experience standpoint, and also the experience of another. So if we introduce the concept of hiding something, to hide something is to obscure it from view, to place it where others may not find it. Now, the person who does the hiding understands where the thing that is hidden is, for the most part. I suppose it is possible for a person to hide something from themselves. It would take time, though. It would necessarily be a situation in which the person would try to forget exactly where it was that they had been. Or, I think of throwing an object into a lake to hide it. Now, of course, we would know where it is, I suppose, in some broad sense. But we may not be able to find it again if it has sunk to the surface beneath. In a like manner, I suppose there is a way in which we can deceive ourselves on the journey to hiding something, whether it be a memory, an object, a thought, a desire, or otherwise, by lying to ourselves, by deceiving ourselves, or by giving enough distance between ourselves and that thing that the mind has difficulty understanding exactly where it had left a particular thing, or how it had left it. So we will take with us both conditions, the self-deceived, but then also the situation in which the self is aware of what is being hidden, and for what purpose. So then, the question is, what does it mean for the hand to be hidden within the bosom? We could say in a literal sense that the purposeful behavior that we show to the world is hidden from others. But it is hidden not because we are some introverted genius who wishes to keep the meaningful things away from others. This is more of an unfortunate example, I think. The hand is hidden to the bosom, I think, because it feels a sense of security, a sense of safety. It is there because the purposeful, the directed maybe the physical manifestation of our thoughts are directed by the heart. But for the hand to be hidden there, I suppose it doesn't necessarily mean that it is directed by it. For I have to understand a little bit more what it means, I think, for something to be hidden. So if I take this coin that's in front of me, and let's say that I'm in an environment where this coin is going to be quite valuable in the sense that others would want to find it, maybe to have it, to take it. And so I place it out of view. Maybe I open up a cabinet, a drawer, and I place it in there. Now it is obscured from my view, from the view of others. Not many would think to look in there to find it. But unlike the drawer, the heart is not that simple. As I mentioned, it is the seat of our desires, our feelings, our wishes. If I place this in some emotional soup, emotional drawer, again, that factory that I use as an analogy sometimes, what is this thing to do there? What is the relationship then of the object that I am leaving there? Of course, this object is not necessarily much like the drawer that I had mentioned. The coin is not as simple as the symbol of the hand. So removing the coin from this exploration and thinking about the heart again as this industrial machine producing our emotions, having an interplay, sort of a local ecosystem in and of itself that responds to the environment, that responds to our thoughts. It satisfies, it deceives, it teaches, it learns. And we place our hand inside of it. A bit strange, certainly, if the hand is to be a symbol that is an extension of. If we place the hand inside of the thing that is supposedly directing that extension, then the hand is no longer fulfilling its purpose. It's no longer an extension of the heart or of the mind. I suppose we could say it's still an extension, but now it is hidden. It is not something that can do purposeful action in the world. It is hidden within the mind. And because it is within the mind, it is not going to be productive. So surely it would make sense that the slothful would hide this type of structure. Again, the tool for manipulating things in the world, for executing purposes, desires, would be subdued by the very thing that ought to be directing it. And thinking about this in more of the feminine context, I think of that over-nurturing sense, for which the nurturing is important for an infant, for a child, to develop and to grow. But the over-nurturing, the aspect of safety that is overdone, what begins to happen is a sort of deformity, a deformity of this position of authority. That the being is so afraid, and it may not just be afraid, there's other possibilities here. Timid, shy, such that the heart feels like a refuge. Now we can imagine an industrial factory, some system that produces products, but it has no distributor. There's no hand that can act in the world. All of those products have nothing to satisfy. And we have to remember that the heart is but an aspect of mind, that there is more of mind that encompasses our experience. And often, I think in most situations actually, our thoughts are paired with some emotion, however slight, sometimes quite lofty. I think our thoughts can be overburdened by our feelings. I think our feelings can be overburdened by our thoughts. But regardless of that relationship, I think that there is a strong one. So I should mention that today is a new day. And a rather strange spot, I think, to leave off a recording. But sometimes this happens in the middle of a thought. So I'll try my best to roughly get back to where I was and what I was talking about. So from what I recall, I was sort of talking about a perverse image, or what was building out to be what appears as a perverse image. The image of the hand in the heart. The image that we are moving towards, of removing the hand towards the mouth. But of course, not necessarily the execution of the task, but more so the inhibition of it for whatever reason, because of the slothful character. And so you gotta wonder about these big psychological factors that flow within us in the spiritual sense. Now, I'm not sure if I had gone into it in any particular detail, but I wasn't necessarily satisfied with the industrial factory of the heart. It's a bit of a brutal illustration or analogy. I think it works well, but there are things that can be added to soften it up a little bit. But anyway, since I'm talking about the hand as it has dove into the pool, so to speak, the pool of the heart again, that place that is the seat of our feelings, our desires, all of our emotions. Again, the hand being the productive extension of ourselves, the extension of the spiritual, the immaterial mind into that of the material, in what would seem a more immediately practical world. I suppose what I'm not necessarily satisfied with is what some of the effects of that heart to the bosom. Now, I know that I have gone over that, and we're moving into the second half of the verse, but it's so important because the hand is now, we will be prompted to consider what would be required to make the sacrifice of moving the hand away from the bosom to the mouth, and what that journey would mean, what it would mean if the hand actually got there to the mouth. But also of the reality of the situation that we are prompted to consider, that is, of the hand as it stays in the bosom, that it doesn't willfully make the journey up to the mouth. I think there is a tendency or a hesitation to think about the heart, at least within the industrial factory example, to think about a situation in which its products are not being used, but the machine keeps running, and then there's a buildup of emotion. I'm not really sure I like that line of thinking. But, all the same, even if we are to put a furthered economic example on there and say, well, there's no demand in the world for it, that would be an interesting relationship. I see almost like a large dog. The hand sits there on the sidewalk outside of that factory waiting for work. And I think about a situation in which the world, or the position that the agent has put him or herself in, is not sufficient to be requiring of it enough, such that the hand must be active, it must be participating, interacting with the world, and that influencing his internal mechanism, that of his reason and of his feelings. And yet here we have a situation in which the heart is somewhat inert. The other aspect of mind is somewhat inert. The executive is passive. That the tool of the hand, the extension of our will, is not being used because our will is not inclined towards aggravation, the moving away from security into something that is more uncomfortable. But let's say for a moment that the hand, the productive element of the immaterial aspects of ourselves, giving the immaterial life within the physical domain, this hand moves up to the mouth. And the question is, well, what business would it have there? Especially given the fact that we understand that in the case where we were not being slothful, we were not being weak, that the hand would make itself up there regularly. But in the case of weakness, in the case of the slothfulness, the hand remains at the bosom where it feels safe. And what's more is that he's grieved by this situation. Like there's an internal torment to it. It grieves him to bring it again to his mouth. Now, what is the mouth? The mouth, I think, much like the hand, has a similar function. It is a tool that is an extension that allows us to speak, and again bring the immaterial into the material domain. Unlike the hand, it is an important causeway for nutrients. And so there's another mention of nutrition, of nurturing. But except, or unlike, I would say, the heart, this nurturing is bodily. It is for the maintenance of the physical structure. Of course, that extends into the mind too. But with the previous example, it would seem more so that when we refer to the heart, we are really referring to the mind. But then, again, of course, there is this secondary aspect of the mouth that is much like the extension of the hand. Almost more so in the sense of how much meaningful information it can move out into the environment. The mouth doesn't really have the capacity to physically build things, but on a layer on top of, maybe we could say in terms of not practicality, but of the heavenly domain as it comes into greater and greater contact with the material. The mouth, again, it doesn't have that physical ability to manipulate the environment to immediately transfer the immaterial again to the material. The hand can execute a task, it can write something, it could build something out of wood and stone. The mouth can assist to a degree in physical purposes, functions, but its activity compared to the hands in terms of doing something in the environment is very limited. Perhaps at one point we caught things with our mouths. Our mouths were more of a carnivorous tool rather than delicately preparing something and having our teeth being accustomed to that and our mouth structure being accustomed to that. But no, the mouth is something elevated in a sense. Elevated surely in terms of in comparison to the hand, but that's not really what we were comparing it to. It's not in the structure of the verse. What we were thinking about is the mouth versus the heart. Now, there are many ways, I think, that this can be interpreted. But it would seem to me that if the hand is to move to the mouth, the purpose for doing it would not necessarily be to speak. You would generally think that if you want to say something, you would move the hand away from the mouth and then say something. So if the hand is going up to the mouth, then perhaps it is bringing the body some nutrients. If it brings the body nutrients, it feeds the whole system, including the heart. And so one must wonder at what this level of advice necessarily means. Now, there's the obvious in the sense that if the hand gets preoccupied with the heart, then we would consider this to be a bad thing. But the question then being, well, how does one get out of that situation? Surely, much like in the modern day, we are on our phones all of the time. To break ourselves from a system that we are quickly becoming sucked into, it would take a lot of focus. It would grieve us to separate ourselves from that stimulus. It would be painful because of the addictive nature of it. And here, as the hand is close to the heart, is close to that feeling of security and comfort that it wishes not to venture out into the world and be productive. Of course, something of stagnation. But if that's what the heart and that's what the hand knows, because of course the heart is not an effective agent if it allows the hand to be idle, then any sort of labor, any sort of action or behavior in the world is going to be rather displeasing to an agent. And an agent's sole responsibility is to do and to be. A decision not to do so would be antithetical to their existence. So the question is, well, where exactly do I come down then on this verse? Because we had just finished mentioning that bringing the hand up to the mouth is not an action that we would speak, that we would do to speak. It's likely that there is a form of nutrient that is entering into the body. And so the broader image of a person that is feeding themselves has found the means to do so. And so there is this, what seems like a forced habit, or a forced by necessity, of breaking the hand away from the bosom, such that it does something in order to eat. But the person is tortured. It's an unfortunate image, really. I see of a person that is hunched over and trembling, that they cannot break themselves free of that comfort, perhaps of an innocence that was once known that they no longer experience. It could be any number of things, I suppose. But again, to reiterate, now existence has become suffering, but not in a good way, that we suffer for positive ends, but that rather this person begins to suffer for negative ends. That they are stuck on an internal feedback loop that they cannot liberate themselves from. That in order to do so, the very thing that they ground themselves in, that slothful being, that is the thing that is causing them their disease, the sickness of mind, for which the very thought of living life to maintain the body so that the mind can continue to exist is a laborious task. Now, I'm not saying that there's some interesting questions that are posed in such a state of mind. I often find myself there. But this is to say that if the truly slothful person is to be, then they are inevitably going to come up onto this feedback loop of grounded in the heart and their own personal desire, but then burdened when they have to break it away, because even the thought is intoxicating to them, and the thought of that safety, security. The sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. So like usual, let's begin with the first half of the verse. The first thing that stands out is that instead of using the word sloth, now we're using sluggard, which would seem to be a derivative of the word sloth. But we'll get into that in time. The sluggard is wiser in his own conceit. So this is a verse that is similar to one that we've seen before within this chapter. Verse 12, see you a man wise in his own conceit? There is more hope of a fool than of him. So aside from having another conversation about conceit, which I think is important, the primary difference between verse 12 and verse 16, which is the one that we are on, is that the second half of the verse is not rounding us back into something that we would expect. There is more hope of a fool than of him. Now, we would expect to not see a man wise in his own conceit, and that is made clear by the second half. There is more hope of a fool than of him. Now in 16, there is this sort of doubling down on the narrative. The sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. And you would imagine that seven men that can render a reason would be slightly wiser than the sluggard that is caught within himself. So we are faced with a few different paths that we can go down here. One is the literal path, a path that I like to take. There's a path that this is a satire of some sort. It's a joke. We can examine the ways in which 7 men coming up with one reason might actually not be better than a sloth or a sluggard in his own conceit. But this is why we begin with the first half. So let's break apart this interesting image of a person. Now, it's of a particular type of person, but just at the outset, of a person that is in something of himself, that is in, he is wise in his conceit. Now, my mind immediately goes to a physical object or structure. My apartment is like such a structure that I'm considering. It's a large place that I myself, including my body, can fit. There are plenty of different places in this apartment. There is my room, which is entirely separate from the living room, which is separate from the bathroom. Now, of the various rooms that I find myself in, or that I can go to, rather, it is an interesting thing to reflect on, of the ways that the mind reacts to the place that it is in. It is often the case in my experience that I don't feel the same in every place that I go to. My room versus my office at work, or various other places that one may go to throughout the day or throughout the week. Often these places, partially by context and purpose, prompt us into a particular type of being. They reveal a particular disposition. It prompts the mind to orient itself towards something. So the office at work, for example, is not a place that I feel immediately at ease. It's a place where I feel that it's time to prepare my mind for work and for intellectual work, and to be productive and to fulfill responsibilities. In my room, which is where I am now, there's an interesting plethora of feelings that I can go through. For this is a place of rest and renewal, but also for a place of study and of spiritual growth. Now, there are plenty of other examples that I can go through that would support the argument that I'm making, that the space that we are in often influences our being, the way in which we interface with the world at that moment. Now, of course, we are willful agents, and our feelings and our desires don't depend on the physical space that we are in. We can will ourselves past that. As soon as I enter my room, I don't feel immediately drowsy or immediately serene and divinely inspired. It takes work and it takes attention to get to where we want to be, full stop. But all the same, one more example perhaps. I was thinking about an experience this weekend at a friend's house in a particular location. I was in his backyard, and we do some grilling when we hang out. And this experience is often filled with conversation, music, and it's a place that allows a certain type of conversation to grow. It facilitates it. The environment is built up such that it is ready to house more of an intimate experience. And so if we turn our attention back to this verse for a moment, and we say, the sluggard is wiser in his own conceit, what we are trying to consider is, well, there's a room in the mind of this particular person. This room may be large, it may be small. But even if it is a large room, even let's say if I left this room and I left this building and I walked outside onto the street, I would still be, even if I'm in the open environment, I would be in the perceptual sphere would have limitations on it. My perceptual sphere, I would say. And so it's local to a degree, even though I'm in a place that's not necessarily a room, but it is wide open. So I say that to say, even if we don't consider within one's own conceit to be a room, but rather actually a quite a substantial portion of that person's mind, perhaps all of that person's mind, then so be it. We can still use this analogy. But much like a person finding themselves in a room and being influenced by the surrounding environment, and thinking about a room that is for a particular purpose, let's say a gym, for example, if people have had experiences going to gyms, if exercise is something that is regular and disciplined, then stepping foot in a gym is often an experience of mild anxiety and elevated heart rates, because one is preparing for what they are entering into. Now, this room of conceit, I think an interesting one to ponder. Because here we find a person that feels themselves to be wise once they enter into it. We could say, well, what kind of a space would facilitate wisdom in an individual? We would first have to ask, well, what is wisdom? Now, I've gone through this many times. I always come back to, now, in terms of the etymology, what we are, the word that we are looking at here essentially means the right way, the right path. There's implications of righteousness in there, but also, I think, profound implications about connectedness. What of two objects and more of their relationships to one another, again, whether it be an object or agents or life. The wise person is one that can see these intricate and detailed patterns of relationships, but also the wise person is afforded the insight to connect people together, to connect things together, to synthesize information from the large patterns, but also the small, to introduce goodness into a particular system. So how can we make sense of an environment, one's own conceit in this situation, that facilitates, that prompts us to this excessive pride in the negative sense? Now, we've explored pride before, and I've come to the conclusion that pride is not inherently a negative thing, but it has negative possibilities. These possibilities have such detrimental effects to our growth and to our overall attention that I think it often gets this this mark, this cultural mark, that at least of the virtuous we ought to be careful about pride and where it might take the mind. But an excess of pride, an excess of satisfaction towards one's own achievements, there's a risk of what I've been calling auto-axialization. It is the divination of the self, the revolving of the self around the idea of itself, the projection of the self. It's an entirely closed system. And a closed system cannot operate effectively in an environment that its own identity depends on relationships to other things. It's potentially dangerous. It's almost as if somebody found suffocation pleasurable for whatever reason. The very thing that they need to survive, what brings them pleasure is depriving themselves of it. So I'd like to bring us back to this room, the room of conceit. For our man in question rests within this room. But the strange thing that I wonder is why, when he sits on that chair in this room, and I imagine that there's nothing in the room other than the chair that sits on top of a oriental rug, and then perhaps a lamp that sits next to him. He sits in this chair, in this room. Now the lack of physical features in the room is by design, because what we're meant to really consider is what this place is doing to the mind. Excessive pride. Such a thing. Spurred on perhaps by what he had done during the day. Spurred on by something that he considers to be an achievement for himself. Of course, this man is a sluggard, so we can imagine his standards. Now, outside of what he may be satisfied with, of his particular achievements, we don't necessarily need to discuss them. What's important is that we explore the effects that his satisfaction brings him. And the important question is, why does he feel wise in this position? Perhaps it is because he feels confident that he achieved something, and there is this positive feedback. And now, since something good has been done, or some perceived good has been done, the positive feeling is enough to convince the self to move past the step or the point of justly being satisfied in something that one has done, to taking it beyond and elevating the self to such a point that the very performance of something that is good is enough for this conceited person to worship it, to worship perhaps the possibility. But of course, for the sluggard and the worshiping of possibility, that possibility never becomes an actuality. But there is much more here to uncover. The sluggard is wiser in his own conceit. So if we go to this drawing board, I imagine in my mind the heart is hard at work, making an individual feel proud, satisfied. All the various mechanisms and physical agents at the heart's disposal to pacify the broader self. Now the sluggard is a person that we can say is slow or lazy. Of laziness, we say that there is a poor will for action, for work, for general exertion. There's a sin that is buried in there, a sin of being idle, being stationary. Now perhaps it is in an unfortunate way, in a perverse way, that an individual becomes exposed to wisdom and its goodness, its possibilities, if one is so inattentive and unwilling to participate in life that once they taste the experience of pride, of accomplishing something, that it is enough to teach them something about the importance of attention. Of course, in the broader scale, this is a form of temptation, because we are being taught something good from a wicked source, a wicked end. At least, in the sense of conceit, it would be the case, because it's excessive pride. It's only the situation in which, once the individual feels that the self ought to be exalted and worshipped because of their achievement over an orienting principle that would actually sustain their attention and get them out of sluggishness, their attention remains reduced to the internal desires. The sluggard is very much this way because they are satisfied with inaction. They're satisfied with, in the modern sense at least, what relatively cheap junk food and alcohol or whatever might do for the mind on a weekend. And it prevents the person from really expanding, being productive, putting value into the world. But again, instead, it goes all to satisfying the heart. And it's not just the heart, it's the corrupt nature of the heart, where we can find ourselves as a broad collective of individuals in a society with a particular form of government. It is always the case, regardless of the form of government, that it can become tyrannical, it can become antithetical to the general populace. But also, regardless of the form of government, it can be good, it can be benevolent. It can cause a golden age in a culture. And much like this, we are dealing with the tyranny within the heart. The tyranny of the sluggard for which he cannot break free. The tyranny that even destroys his will to understand that what is good is beyond that which chains him, which is the superficial satisfaction. The conceit is just an extension of his unfortunate desire for that nothingness, for the idle nature, for that passivity. So today happens to be a new day. The goal for today is to finish the second part of this verse, which will be the end of this episode. You know, as the days go on, and as the reflections continue, as they grow, my mind, in its own strange little way, I think recognizes where it falls short. And it desperately tries to ramp up something within myself to pay attention, to be better, and to continue to be faithful. But of course, this process, regardless of one's explicit knowledge of something, of some truth, it doesn't mean that that truth is going to be any easier to integrate into one's experience. It doesn't mean it's going to be any easier to integrate it into my experience. There's a whole other facet of this reflective process. Reflection is one thing, and putting it into action is another. Sometimes the reflection and self-honesty is the most difficult part, and sometimes the implementation is the difficult part. But as it stands now in my life, it would seem that the implementation part is where I struggle. Sometimes I succeed, and other times I fail. But as a part of this reflection, regardless of my failures, there is a part of my mind that is deeply committed, that is faithful to moving away from the types that we've been talking about here, the foolish, the slothful, the sluggard. The sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. So such a strange comparison. At the outset I had mentioned the possibility that the fact that it takes 7 men to render a reason is a bit odd. It would seem that of the 7 men, there should be one that ought to render some reason. Now I suppose it's also possible that each man independently is rendering a reason. But it is likely the case that given the context, we are talking about the collective that is producing this one reason. For it would be impossible to know whether or not it's better for one person to give a reason regardless of where that reason is from. It could be from his conceit or might not be. Both situations cannot be true. So it's unlikely that one person, or rather 7 individuals, are giving us the rendering of some thought or expression. But rather it's the 7 together that causes the rendering of reason. Now it could be said that the reason in question is something that had come about from debate, from dialogue between the various members. And it is because of this debate and conversation that had strengthened the reason, and that was the thing that was put forth. But there are many types of reasons, some more simple than others. And so if we are to take this reason and to say any reason, any explanation, any potential cause that is identified, it would not take much even for the simple-minded to come up with something to satisfy that category. So in a broad sense, I think what we are being asked to consider here is the better of two things that are not positive in nature. On one hand, we have a certain type of prisoner, a person that is blinded by their own view of themselves. But it is the very view of themselves that gives them the motivation to move above and beyond a type of foolishness, only of course to fall back into it perhaps even more deeply because of the exalting of the self. But that brief moment, as I've mentioned, is something that gives them an insight into something that they had not known before. It is part of the reason why they exalt the self so much. And so in this way, even the sluggard, in his conceit and his excessive pride and his satisfaction over his own lowly accomplishments, this is better than a group of individuals that are unable to give an explicit thought to anything. So at the very least, I think the image that this affords us is the graduated nature of this experience. And although we may be prompted to consider the dangers of foolishness and the dangers of the slothful being, what we also have to remember is that despite these unfortunate characters, there still rests other possibilities outside of even the characterization. It is just the abject individual and the failure of that individual to act and to pay attention and to understand causes, that this is sufficient to be deemed lower or worse than an excessively prideful, lazy person. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, finishing off here with verse 16. I'll continue next time with verse 17 of chapter 26 of the Proverbs.